Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. What we have lined up for today is a brief webinar where we're going to be going through using the SmartConnect REST connection, the REST connector we have inside of smartconnect.com, and how we can utilize that to connect to other applications that we don't have a default connector for. So if you're on the wrong webinar, will not be disappointed if you drop off. Otherwise, thank you for sticking around on here. At the end of the session or throughout the session, I will have the Q&A panel open on my other screen. So I'm completely fine with stopping, going through any questions that may come up during the process. So again, unfortunately, due to it being a general webinar, I do have to have people muted for the most part, just because of the number of attendees on here. But otherwise, yeah, shoot through your chat, your questions. I'll try to answer those as we're going through the session. So a quick introduction of myself. I'm Chris Hansen. I'm our SmartConnect product manager here at E1 Solutions. So I've been with the company for over 10 years now. I live in Fargo, North Dakota, which is why we're all bundled up in that family picture that I have of ourselves. Now, what we have for today for the agenda. First is just a quick SmartConnect overview. This webinar is geared for attendees that are already familiar with the product of SmartConnect and SmartConnect.com to some extent. So we won't be spending a lot of time on the overview. It'll just be a quick recap for anyone that does happen to be joining to cover that. The majority of the time will be spent discussing the new SmartConnect.com REST connector and the connection you can set up with that. And then we'll show an example of what it looks like to actually build a couple integrations off of a REST configuration that you have created. Finally, at the end, we'll leave time for question and answers. And then finally, I'll have my contact information up at the very end of the session for anyone that wants to get a hold of me if you don't have my information already. So for SmartConnect, again, we position SmartConnect as your integration platform of choice. It's designed with the functional consultant or the power user in mind. You don't have to be a developer. You don't have to write code inside of there. It allows us to set up our integrations, migrate data or do those ongoing synchronizations and the automation that you need when setting up a integration solution. So this is my last slide. I'm not a huge fan of slides, so we'll jump into product very quickly here. But what we're going through is when we look at SmartConnect, this graph does a very good idea of highlighting what we're able to do. So each of those 4 different sections illustrate a component of SmartConnect and how that's going to tie together. So the first one, the top of the data source, that's simply where we're picking the data up from. The destination is where we're sending it to. So those connections for both the data source and the destination are very similar in terms of where we can get data from, where we can send it to. Generally, you can get data from more locations than we can send it to. So if you're just using like a basic ODBC or OADB driver, you can pick data up from those older systems that you might not necessarily be able to write back to. Now these middle 2 sections on here, triggers in the transformation area, are what we can do on the specific integrations. So for the triggers, this is saying how and when you want that integration to run. So you can do real-time change tracking or manual. And that's just deciding, do we want this to be fully automated? Is there going to be user involved? Otherwise, on the right side of there, the external call, the scheduler, or the web service, we can go ahead and set that up to go ahead and run either through your own custom code or through doing it, within the SmartConnect interface and just setting up the scheduler here. All right, so the transformation section is where SmartConnect gets most of the value from it. And that's because when you're sending data from one system to another, a lot of times that data is not going to match perfectly. So you have to do some transformation of the data. That might be as simple as doing a translation table and just going, here's my 4 values I could get. Here's the 4 it translates over to. Or it could be something like you need to go ahead and convert a date from one format to another. You might have to run multiple integrations together and chain them all in one process. That's able to be done through our SmartConnect interface as well. Now, that's the general overview. That's what I said I'd have for slides in the entirety. So let's go ahead and actually switch over to the product. So I'm not going to go through each window in detail, but this is going to be fairly direct and focused on the REST service piece of SmartConnect. Now, if you're familiar with SmartConnect and have used it for a while, especially the on-premise component of SmartConnect, there is a REST connector inside of that on-premise version. We actually had a webinar. We have a separately scheduled webinar that goes through that current REST connector. What we're focusing on in this particular call is going to be the new REST connection that we've been developing with SmartConnect.com. Now, the idea is to roll this down to the on-premise version as well once we go ahead and get that code merged. And this will be the new REST connection that we use going forward in both products. So we're not getting rid of the old REST connector that we've got in place. That's going to continue to exist if you have any integration set up on that. But we're not going to be building new functionality into that because this one is going to be taking the place for ongoing and future development. Now, you might be wondering what I'm talking about. So what we have in here is a REST services window under the maintenance section. And what we've got in place here is the ability to build new connection points for SmartConnect. And what I refer to when I'm saying that is if we look at the current connection list in SmartConnect and what we can connect to, when we click Create Connection, we normally have a set of about 7 to 8 default connections that are listed in there for whether you want to pull data from them or send data into that. Now, when I open this list up, I've got quite a few more than the standard SmartConnect environment as we're making new connections with our REST connector. Now, if you've never seen this connection list before, you can't really tell them apart one from the other, which is the point of it. We're able to build those out and they're going to fit in just like a regular connection would. Now, what I'll be focused on is actually what goes on behind the scenes to build these connections out. So if I look at my maintenance tab and look at my REST services, this is where we do the initial configuration for any of these new connection points. Now, as I'm going through this, I do want to point out I am on our QA environment. So a few of the things I'm showing are not live quite yet. If you look at a live SmartConnect.com environment, you'll see the REST service list in here, but it's going to be focused just on the data source piece of setting up that REST connector. So right now on live, it allows you to pull data from a system. On QA, and what we're working towards is releasing the update that includes the destination piece of it as well. So if you build a new REST connector, you can both send and receive data from any of these environments. Now, the one that I'm going to open up today is going to be for HubSpot. So our demo that we're going to do later on is going to be looking at HubSpot companies and the HubSpot contacts that are going through. And yeah. Well, I'll just show the back end for it first. We'll talk about the setup. We'll dive into some of the API. So it's going to get a bit technical. So if you're not a technical person on the call, I apologize. That's going to be the main focus of the majority of the content here. So let's go into HubSpot, and I'll go ahead and edit the service in this list. And what we get is a menu section in here that allows us to go through and set up the different required components for HubSpot. Now, I'm not going to go through every window on this. This isn't a full-blown training. This is just kind of an overview to show you what is going to be possible with the tool. So with HubSpot, normally when you think of HubSpot, you're thinking of HubSpot contacts. And sure enough, when we go to HubSpot, if we look at the main list here in HubSpot, their very first item is contacts, and they actually have it split out between contacts and companies. So our integrations we're going to focus on for this webinar are going to be syncing up contacts and companies from our Dynamics 365 environment to HubSpot. And in this case, we're going to be pushing those across as they get created. There's other integration points in here as well that we could do. We could do tasks and deals. You could tie those to, activities inside of CRM, and you could have a custom entity for deals if you wanted to. But if you can connect to part of the system, the rest of it's going to flow through in a very similar manner. So for SmartConnect and looking at HubSpot, basic idea, we can throw an image in here, nothing fancy. Lets it display nicely when we're looking at our connection list. But the majority of the detail comes in where we're doing the settings, which then includes setting up authentication, and then includes setting up how we can pull or push data to that system. Now I'm going to flip back and forth a couple times between the SmartConnect setup screen that I've already configured and the API overview section of HubSpot, because this is the one I've chosen to focus on. because anytime you're setting up a new REST connection, you need to pull that information off of their API documentation page. So if you're looking at and wondering whether SmartConnect can connect to another system, the first thing that we always recommend looking at is what does their documentation look like. If they've got zero documentation, it's going to make it very difficult to go ahead and try to guess or configure anything on your own. So looking at this REST setup and looking at the settings section, the main thing that we've changed from the old REST connector, if you're familiar with that, with the on-premise SmartConnect, is we've allowed for additional authentication methods. Back on the original REST connector, the only thing built in the interface would be the basic authentication, or none would technically work as well. We've updated this to handle exchange tokens as a method that we can go ahead and connect with, and then also the most common standard that exists now on any current API is going to be OAuth 2, allowing you to go ahead and set that up. So any recent API or anything that's been updated in the last 6 months to a year or so is focusing on OAuth 2 if it's a large scale application. So HubSpot being one of those, we're able to go ahead and pick OAuth 2 for our authentication method and set that up. Now, if you're familiar with REST services and authenticating, you'll know that OAuth 2 has some processes built in where you have to do a callback URL. It has to have a token, might have a refresh, an access token, might have a refresh token. And that's all stuff that we couldn't do in the old REST connector that is handled now if we choose the correct authentication method. So jump around a bit. I'll go to the OAuth settings. Because we pick OAuth 2, we're able to fill out this window in here. I'm not going to go through step by step, but the main idea is the first URL is where you get your authorization calls from. You get your access token from the remainder here, and then down at the bottom, you can say, all right, if you're using a refresh token, where do we call that from? How long does the refresh token last before we have to go ahead and refresh it again? So different systems have it set up in different manners where sometimes you have to do it on a periodic basis. HubSpot requires that we refresh it before every 6 hours. Other systems might have you send that request through before it attempts any call from SmartConnect. Other times you just wait for it to fail out and pass that through as well. So setting this up allows SmartConnect on the back end to go ahead and keep that refresh token active. So anytime one of our integrations run that references HubSpot, it's going to connect just fine using these settings. Now, the other main thing we've added on the data source side in the new REST connector compared to the old one is we handle paging now. So this is another feature that is present in most current REST services where they'll page through data when it returns large amounts of records. So services do it all differently. So we have multiple different options that we're able to go ahead and set up. With HubSpot, they use an actual path on here where they say, all right, here's your URL that we're going to be using for the next set of those paged records. So setting this up in SmartConnect allows us to go ahead and return all of those pages of data before we display it in SmartConnect, which is needed when you're pulling data in because you want to have that full data set before you start grouping that data down into different transactions and records as you push it through to the destination system. So finally, the last two useful sections that we're going to be focusing on are the service entities and the service actions. So the entities are going to be used for our data source. These are saying, all right, what data do we want to pull out from our HubSpot environment in this case? So we're looking at a few different things in here. We've set up lists around companies, the actual contacts themselves. We've got a list on here called recent companies. And what these are is they're all coming back from the API overview when we look that up. So if I open up one of these, say recent companies, inside of here, I could just get to say, all right, what endpoint is actually being called? And that is determined from HubSpot. So if I go ahead and say, all right, let's look at the API overview. We're working with companies right now, is what we wanted to find. Let's go ahead and look at their options to pull data out. So HubSpot has a very well documented API, which is partly why I chose it for this webinar. One of the things they've got in here is they list out every different endpoint, every different method we can call, whether we're sending data into it with creates and updates, or we're getting data out. So in SmartConnect, I've set up a couple of them in here. We've got a generic one that says get all companies. That's not the one I opened, but that's a different one. And then we also have a get recently created companies. So if I open this up, you can see the URL path that they give us is the company's v2 recent created. That matches up exactly with what we've dropped in here. And then when we're back on the documentation, it also shows us what the payload is going to look like when we pull this data back, and any parameters that we can put on the URL if we wanted to. Now, I'm not adding any additional parameters in here because I don't want to limit my count of records. I'm just going to call the base URL that says, all right, grab everything that's been recently created, and then it's going to tell us exactly what's going to be returned inside of here. So in SmartConnect, what we want to do is with this payload that it returns on the side, that's what gets defined inside the fields. So we're able to go ahead and say, all right, here's all the different fields that are coming back. And if we actually look at, here's all the different fields that are coming back, and we can actually load this in from a file. So that payload that they put on any page that's got good documentation, you can copy out that payload, save it in a JSON file, and then you can just load it in from here, and it's automatically going to format all of the pathing for us. So you can see if we're looking at create date, you can see that's down a few levels. Results, properties, created date, value. If we found that inside of here, we'd find that in the appropriate section as we're looking through all the different trees and all the different levels that we have. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time focused on this, but it's important that if you have an example, you just do that load from file, because that's going to ensure that SmartConnect knows how to traverse that data that's being pulled back from the REST connector. So that's pulling data out, is defining the fields that we want to see in there. Very similar process when we're sending data in. So if we look at the service actions now, this would be the destination side for any map that we wanted to set up. So I've set up a few of them in here, company, contact, and deals. I'm going to focus on the company and contact as everyone understands those. You don't have to be familiar with Dynamics 365 or HubSpot to understand what a company or an account might be, and then what a contact is underneath that. Now, if we look at one of these, this also has the details that we need to fill out in terms of how we want to push that data across. So again, we grab the endpoint that's coming from the documentation. Once again, the request method, again, that's coming from the documentation on there and how we want to send that data across. What I will say on here, if you aren't that familiar with it, is normally if you're getting data out of a system, the majority of the time they do a get call. If you're going ahead and sending data in, if you're creating new records, that's almost always a post. If you're doing an update, that's normally a put, but could also be one of a post or patch, which is why the documentation is so important. And I keep referencing that when we're going through. So what we do internally, if we need to set up a new one, if somebody was to go ahead and run through this on their own, that'll also be the process to do so. Now, when we set up the destination, there's a few steps that we need to include in here. And we've got it broken out into two different sections. We're going to use both the field and the body portion of this. And I'll explain why as we're going through. So the field portion, these are the fields that are going to show up in the mapping screen in SmartConnect. So if you've used SmartConnect before and you're familiar with an integration, when you set it up and you do your field mapping to the destination, you get the list of fields that you want to map to in that destination window. All right, so this is just showing what's going to show up in that mapping screen. So right now I've put in about 10 or so different fields in here. When we open the map that uses this as a destination, we're going to see all 10 that we map to. However, the fields that we map to might be split apart into different levels or in a different order when it comes to that payload that you send through to the REST connector. And that's where the body comes in. And this is where we format how that data is going to look as it gets passed through to that API. So it might be a little strange that we're breaking it out, but there's a very good reason for this. On our current REST connector with on-premise, this process isn't broken out, which means any value that shows up inside of here shows up as a field that we get a map to inside the SmartConnect mapping screen. So what it's actually looking for is in the current one, this value, these are all key value pairs that exist in here where you've got the value and then a parameter after that. Inside of the current SmartConnect, the on-premise, this would show up as the column name that you get to map to. And then this would be the value that you actually map through to it. If we look at a different API, and I apologize, I should have had this pulled open, but I didn't. And this is getting fairly in-depth, but it's a good illustration of how different each REST API can be from one another and why we had to do it this way. Is if I look at this documentation for Zendesk, this is a support help desk. If I look at something simple like a user in here, and we're going to go ahead and look at the create user. The API that, or the payload that is included, I was hoping for a longer payload, but they're giving just a short one, shows us what it ends up starting to look like. So if you're creating a user in Zendesk, every key value pair starts with the label, and then it has the actual value that you want to pass through after that. So you get your ID and then the value, the name, the value. You might have address 1, address 2, city, state, zip, all as labels, and then those values as the actual data you pass in. This is a good example of an API that works fine with the current REST connector, because inside of that, every one of these labels would show up as a field you get a map to, and then inside the mapping screen, you pass through the columns that would actually contain this data. HubSpot is a great example of one that would not work like that when we're looking at doing the creates. Because again, if we're looking at the ability to go ahead and pass in, if we're looking at these for the input value or the column labels, and these being the values you pass in, that's not what it's looking for in HubSpot. In their case, they just do a list. This never changes, right? This is just defining what's actually being passed in below. And then every value that actually has a value, very confusing, I know, would have what we're trying to pass in. So it's set up in a different manner where the current REST connector couldn't handle it, but because we've broken it apart and we're able to define these, we can actually see what we're gonna want as it's coming across. And we're also gonna be able to name these differently, right? They're not dependent on this column name over here. We're actually gonna see the values name, city, state, etc., rather than just value, 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 and have to guess at which one's which. So again, I apologize if not everyone followed that. But if you use the current REST connector and you've tried something like this, you know the issue that we ran into in the past. And it's just because REST services are now designed in many different ways. So what we're looking at is I haven't built this payload out fully yet, right? So I just put name, city, and state in here. So technically when we do the mapping, if I map any of these other fields besides name, city, and state, they're not gonna do anything yet because I haven't put them into the payload that's gonna be sent across. Now, we can add additional fields in here. This is on QA, so the destination piece isn't live yet. I mentioned that earlier on, but we'll also have a load from file to get the basic JSON loaded in, and then we could replace with the actual field names that we wanted from our field list on there. So we won't have to type everything out. All right, so that's a lot of details on what the setup looks like initially. The good news around this is once this gets configured, you don't have to do it again unless you want to add another service endpoint in later. The other good news is these can be imported and exported from your environment, and we'll also be able to make these definitions from the E1 side. So we can build these out for you to go ahead and consume in your own environments, which means there's a good shot that if it's a widely popular product and we get a lot of requests in for that, we can build that out, make it an officially supported one that you'll be able to load in from your environment without having to do all that REST setup on your own. I did want to walk through that though, because I know there's going to be people out there that want to go hands-on. They want something we don't have built yet, and they want to do it from scratch on their own, which is where we're going to do it through. Now, once that definition is complete, and by no means have I covered all the HubSpot endpoints. Like I mentioned earlier, they've probably got 40 or so different endpoints that would be useful. We're focusing on accounts or companies and contacts, again, for this one, so I have those configured. They're the ones I'm going to reference in my integration. So once that's built out and we go back to connections, we could add that from the connection list, and I've already got it created in here so I won't have to build everything from scratch. That is not the icon that should be showing. There we go. I'm running on QA though, so makes me a little nervous doing a live demo. But what we have set up in here is our HubSpot connection. It's showing it's one of our REST connectors we've configured. So if you import in that REST definition that has everything you want, all you're gonna have to be looking for is the connection details on here, the client ID and secret, since we're doing OAuth 2, and that's gonna allow us to go ahead and set up that connection and save it. Now from this point on, once we have that REST connection configured, we're able to go ahead and reference that. We're able to reference that in any integrations that we want to set up. So I've already done a couple of them in here. What I went through is I've created a pair of real-time triggers to one of my Dynamics 365 customer engagement environments. Now if this loads in, And apologies for that icon. That is a QA thing. That's not the main loading icon we see in live. But if I go in here, I've created a real-time trigger on my account entity and on my contact entity inside of a sandbox environment for customer engagement. So I've done that so I can attach a pair of integrations to that, and we can show some data flowing across. Now for the integrations themselves, I've got two of them in here. I've got a contact process that goes from customer engagement contacts over to HubSpot. And I've also got the customer engagement accounts that go over to the HubSpot companies. And this is the one I'll open up to start with here. Now, if you've built an integration before in SmartConnect.com, this is going to be a very similar process to that. All right, so for the integration process, I can give the ID and the name on here. For the data source, I'm using that customer engagement real-time event that I'm looking for. I've got it triggering on the account entity, and we're sending it over, grouping on the account name as we send it across to HubSpot. For the target, I was able to go ahead and pick HubSpot for my list of different connection points that we've been testing out in my environment. When I pick HubSpot, I can then go ahead and pick the group. This is part of the REST definition that I didn't show just because it happens to do with the organization in here. But I pick company, and the only endpoint I've got created in the company right now is that create company endpoint. So I can mark that, and that shows as my destination. When I switch to the integration tab and we look at the target integration point, as I mentioned, these are the fields, about the 10 fields or so that I had defined in that field mapping window. So those show up inside of here. So if I wanted to change the names on here and make them better, like instead of company ID, I might want to put, company space ID or a company space identifier. If you want to make it a, better display name, prettier for the end user in here. Now what I said is the only ones I put in the payload were name, city, and state. So those are the three that I've mapped through from my data source over to these destination fields. So this is no different from any map that we're setting up now at this point in time. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've already got it registered on the create event inside of CRM. And I've done the same thing with the contact. I went ahead and created the contact. We're doing the first name, last name, email, the company it's tied to inside of there as well. So we can go ahead and bring that data across additionally. So for that REST connector, and I'll go in here and run them in a minute, I just want to re-emphasize that once that REST connector is set up, it works like any other connection point does inside of SmartConnect. Our integration windows don't change. The field mapping process stays the same. You still get the additional columns, the tasks, and everything else that you can run on that process. So since those are real time, I don't have to trigger them manually. I can actually come into CRM here, and this is my sandbox environment that I've got it all tied to. And we'll take a look at the account entity first, and we'll create a new one on here. So when I was testing earlier, I was going through doing different football teams. So I've already done the Vikings. We'll go ahead and put one of our division rivals in here if anyone else is a football fan. We'll put Detroit Lions in here because I know that's a team that we can beat compared to the other ones, which gets a little questionable. I'm going to make a relationship type of customer. I can't remember if I added a filter on that or not. And I do know that I want a city and a state in here. So let's go ahead and make sure we put them inside of Detroit. We'll do Detroit, Michigan on there. And we'll tab off of that so we have at least the city and state, the fields that I know we have mapped. So I know we had the account name, we have the address, we have the relationship type of customer. Let's go ahead and save this process, and that should kick off our integration. Now, if I want to check if this integration is running, this isn't something you normally have to do, but if, again, I expect to have more technical people on this call. If we're using a real-time trigger from CRM, we can actually see if that fires off from the CRM system by checking the settings system jobs first. So we should see this integration trigger come through, possibly. So ran it earlier today when I created that. There we go. We can see that the plugin for the real-time event is in progress here. So as long as it's in progress, it hasn't been sent to SmartConnect yet. Once that plugin says succeeded, we know it's been handed off to the SmartConnect web service, so I can then check the status in SmartConnect before continuing on. So again, not something you normally have to do. I just wanted to point that out. If there's anyone on the call that's interested in how our real-time plugins fire. So I'm just going to go to our main dashboard on this because I should see the latest integration run from here. So we've got our account to HubSpot company that just ran at 10:30, and we've got all green on that. So that looks like it succeeded, which is good. Let's also go ahead and build a contact out here while we're at it to make sure that integration is going to run. And we'll put somebody that's at the line. So we'll put Matthew Stafford in here. Use the Lions quarterback if anyone's on that does not follow football. And we'll just make up an email here, matt@lions.com. And we will save that as well. Now, so that should fire in the background. So I should be able to switch over to HubSpot here. And first I'll take a look at my companies that I've got. And you can see our new Detroit Lions process was created here today at 10:30. We've got our name in here, and we didn't map much else in the integration yet, but we did provide the city and the state. So those came across Detroit, Michigan, just fine as we built that out. Additionally, I just sent over Matthew Stafford. So if I take a look at our contacts, we should have a new contact in here as well. And this takes a little bit longer to load because we've used this environment for heavy amounts of testing. So we actually have 3,000 contacts we've pumped through just to test out the API endpoints. But what we should get is if I refresh this, so we should see our new contact come in. If they don't, I'm going to go back to SmartConnect and check to ensure that nothing failed as we tried to integrate that across. Not seeing it. So let's see if we had a failure on here. Oh, nope, it said it ran contact to contact at 10:31. I could potentially be using this list incorrectly. There we go. Sure enough, we've got Matthew Stafford, Matt at Lions. I thought they would pop up at the top. They did not, but we've got that contact came across as well. First and last name and email is the only components that I provided in that. So that's showing it actually running and sending through. Now that's using REST as the destination. If we want to use it as a data source, I don't have an integration set up to pull data back. But a good one that we could use in this scenario would be an integration that pulls back the company information and sends that back over to Dynamics 365. So what we can do here is if I want to look at my data source, I'll just show that we could go ahead and create a new query to pull those companies out, right? Because we're passing across company name, city, state, all their information if I would have mapped that, but we're not sending over to the company, an account ID specifically. That ID is being created on the HubSpot side. So if I wanted to pull that information back, what I could do is build a bulk query. I'll use HubSpot as my data source, and then I'll use that endpoint that I've set up previously, that recent companies endpoint. We could use that to pull back company information that's been updated. Again, their limit is the last 30 days, so we're going to get a few more records than we need to, but we could flag this integration as an updating process going back to CRM to ensure that we've got it all synced up. So I'll call it recent companies HubSpot for my description. We'll pick HubSpot as my connection point here. And then under the company group, we can look at the recent companies. So if I validate that and preview it, these are all companies that we went through and created within the last 30 days. We've got Lions Park Computers, Detroit Lions, Minnesota Vikings, and Jones Industries still in here. We also have the specific company ID is pulled back as part of that payload. And that's where I'm saying we could go back, write an integration that updates the account entity and sends through this company ID as part of it. Additionally, we could even tie this data source and this second map we'd build as a map success task on that first one. So if the real-time map sends across the company account name, creates the company, once it completes, it could immediately call this integration afterwards to ensure everything's been synced up on the other side. So again, that gives us just the data that we're working with. If we didn't want to work with company, let's say we want to go over to contact, I've set up one endpoint on there called contacts. We can go ahead and preview this as well. Now what's not present in here yet, but we're working on is adding an extra filter option to our REST API data sources. Because when working with REST, The majority of them should be OData compliant now as well, which means we can do OData filtering on that data that's coming back, which would allow us to limit the number of columns we return, which is good because it reduces the overall size of the data you're sending back and forth. We could use OData filtering to actually limit the number of rows based on our criteria we have as well, which once again gets us just the records we're looking for. So look for that as something that's going to be added in the future as well. So I said today was going to be a lot of hands-on with this. If you were to look at this new REST connector yourself, right now, if you're in SmartConnect.com live system, the REST service is still there. You can still go through and configure new REST connections, but it's just the data source piece of it, which is why I'm presenting from the QA system today. We're working hard. We're trying to get the destination piece out by the end of the year. Has been our target goal. As we test it out on more and more different APIs, we're finding how many unique scenarios there really are in terms of how they can format payloads, which is a pain for us, which is pushing it back a bit, but we're still trying to get it out by the end of the year. So you guys can take a look at this like I'm working with here right now. The good news is this is not something that's going to be, we're not going to halt development on it after we put the release out. We're going to continue to add new features in, new authentication methods, new ways of handling those formats we run across with you, our partners and customers, to get those up and running. So that is what I had for today. Let me take a look at the questions we have in the list here. All right, so a couple came in that I've already answered on whether this is available or not. The data source side is available in SmartConnect.com right now. Destination piece, we're aiming for the end of the year. For the on-premise SmartConnect, I see a few questions around when this will work with that. The next major release for our on-prem SmartConnect, we're aiming for early Q1 next year, is going to be our merge code release. If your partner on the call, we've talked about in the latest couple partner calls that we're merging the back end between SmartConnect.com and on-premise SmartConnect, which means anything we're adding into SmartConnect.com is going to be present in the on-premise environment as well, which would include this new REST connector. So right now, if you're waiting for that, you need to wait just a little bit longer to make that available. That's mainly aimed at people on the call here and users that are using GP as a destination. GP does not exist in SmartConnect.com as a destination point right now. We're using the on-prem SmartConnect for that. So you have to wait till the next major release. This will be included with that then as well. All right, anything else? Question around documentation on this. Yes, we're going to be updating our documentation to handle the new REST connector. What it's going to look like, and we're going to be doing an overhaul for our SmartConnect documentation in general. But right now, where you can expect this to be added in is if you go to the main SmartConnect.com site, not app.smartconnect.com or whatever region you happen to be in, just the main site on here. When we go ahead and take a look at resources, we do have a knowledge base section. Now this knowledge base is actually the user manual for SmartConnect.com by default. So we've just taken the standard user manual and we've broken it out into our different sections for the connectors we're using. Now we need to add a few more points in here for features we've been adding in recently. We're also going to have to add the section in for using the REST connection, the REST maintenance. So we'll set that up, we'll add it in, and we'll see those appear in here along with everything else that we happen to have. So look for it in that location first. All right, otherwise, I'm not seeing additional questions at this time. If you have questions in the future on here and want to get a hold of me, it's my phone, my email, along with our main ewinsolutions.com site. Apologize, I should have smartconnect.com on there as a site as well to go reference. But yes, thank you everyone for attending this webinar live, for those of you that were here, and for anyone that's watching this on a recorded version. If you get this, feel free to send messages through to my email. If it's also a sales related question, if you can't get a hold of me, you can send to sales@ewinsolutions.com. If you're a current user of SmartConnect and it's a technical question that you want assistance with, again, either myself, I can serve that role as well, or over to support@ewinsolutions.com on that side. So thank you all. Hope everyone has a good day.